Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to another episode of Conan Chronicles. Today, we're going to be ruminating on the 14th Conan story ever published, Jewels of Gwahlur, or as it was known in its first publication, The Servants of Bit Yakin. This one was written by Robert E. Howard, of course, and first published in the March 1935 issue of Weird Tales magazine. Our story begins in the kingdom of Keshan, one of the so-called Black Kingdoms. This region of the world during the Hyborian Age is named for the African complexion of the native people who live in these lands. Keshan lies between the kingdoms of Stygia and Darfar to the northwest, and Punt and Zimbabwe to the east. Conan had come to the kingdom searching for a fabled treasure of an ancient city that had fallen into legend. The city of Alkmeenon was said to be the hiding place of the treasure known as the Teeth of Gwahlur, a series of jewels supposedly ripped from the mouth of a god that glow with a supernatural fire icy cold to the touch. Outsiders are very unwelcome in Keshan, so Conan needed to do some political maneuvering in order to move freely within the kingdom's borders. However, when we first meet him, the barbarians' negotiations had hit a roadblock that threatened to end his welcome presence in these lands.
Keshan was a barbaric kingdom lying in the eastern hinterlands of Kush, where the broad grasslands merge with the forests that roll up from the south. The people were a mixed race, a dusky nobility ruling a population that was largely pure Negro. The rulers, princes, and high priests claimed descent from a white race which, in a mythical age, had ruled a kingdom whose capital city was Alkmeenon. Conflicting legends sought to explain the reason for that race's eventual downfall and the abandonment of the city by the survivors. He had found Keshan, which in itself was considered mythical by many northern and western nations, and he had heard enough to confirm the rumors of the treasure that men called the Teeth of Gwahlur. With cool assurance he made his offer to the stately, plumed, suspicious grandees of the barbarically magnificent court. He was a professional fighting man. In search of employment, he said, he had come to Keshan. For a price, he would train the armies of Keshan and lead them against Punt, their hereditary enemy, whose recent successes in the field had roused the fury of Keshan's irascible king. This proposition was not as audacious as it might seem. Conan's fame had preceded him, even into distant Keshan. His exploits as a chief of the Black Corsairs, those wolves of the southern coasts, had made his name known, admired, and feared throughout the Black Kingdoms. All Conan secretly desired was employment to give him legitimate excuse for remaining in Kashan long enough to locate the hiding place of the teeth of Gwahlur. Then there came an interruption. Thut-Mekri came to Kashan at the head of an embassy from Zimbabwe. Thut-Mekri was a Stygian, an adventurer and a rogue whose wits had recommended him to the twin kings of the great hybrid trading kingdom, which lay many days' march to the east. He and the Cimmerian knew one another of old, and without love. Thut-Mekri likewise had a proposition to make to the king of Kashan, and it also concerned the conquest of Punt, which kingdom, incidentally, lying east of Kashan, had recently expelled the Zimbabwean traders and burned their fortresses. His offer outweighed even the prestige of Conan. He pledged himself to invade Punt from the east with a host of black spearmen, Shemetish archers, and mercenary swordsmen, and to aid the king of Kashan to annex the hostile kingdom. The benevolent kings of Zimbabwe desired only the monopoly of the trade of Kashan and her tributaries, and, as a pledge of good faith, some of the teeth of Gwahlur. These would be put to no base usage, Thut-Mekri hastened to explain to the suspicious chieftains. They would be placed in the temple of Zimbabwe beside the squat gold idols of Dagon and Derketo, sacred guests in the holy shrine of the kingdom, to seal the covenant between Kashan and Zimbabwe. This statement brought a savage grin to Conan's hard lips. The Cimmerian made no attempt to match wits and intrigue with Thut-Mekri and his Shemetish partner, Zargeba. He knew that if Thut-Mekri won his point, he would insist on the instant banishment of his rival. There was but one thing for Conan to do: find the jewels before the king of Kashan made up his mind, and flee with them. While he fumed with nervous impatience, the high priest Gwahlur announced that before any decision could be reached, the will of the gods must be ascertained concerning the proposed alliance with Zimbabwe and the pledge of objects long held holy and inviolate. The oracle of Alkmeenon must be consulted. Not for a century had the priests visited the silent city. The oracle, men said, was the Princess Yelaya, the last ruler of Alkmeenon, who had died in the full bloom of her youth and beauty, and whose body had miraculously remained unblemished throughout the ages. Old priests had made their way into the haunted city, and she had taught them wisdom. The last priest to seek the oracle had been a wicked man, who had sought to steal for himself the curiously cut jewels that men called the teeth of Gwahlur. But some doom had come upon him in the deserted palace, from which his acolytes, fleeing, had told tales of horror that had for 100 years frightened the priests from the city and the oracle.
The opening scene of the story sees the Cimmerian climbing a cliff, rising out of the Kashanian jungle, while he searches for a small cavern near the cliff's peak. He finds it and crawls inside. There, on the cavern floor, is a mummified corpse, shriveled and browned by the passing of hundreds of years. Between the mummy's crossed arms is what Conan had climbed the cliff in search of, a roll of ancient and yellowed parchment. Conan had rode without sleep for a night, a day, and yet another night, to try and reach the lost city of Alkmeenon before the high priests of Kashan could retrieve the jewels of Gwahlur as an offering to the kings of Zimbabwe. The parchment, according to rumors, held clues to the resting place of this treasure. With these advantages of time and the cryptic knowledge of the scroll over the priests, Conan confidently stalks into the halls of the ancient city with the grace and stealth of a wild panther. The city Conan walks through appears as a ghostly vision of the past, a once grand square where royalty held court and a vibrant culture thrived. Now, this place is overgrown by the jungle and seemingly long abandoned. Conan walks past the ornate throne of a long-dead king, adorned with jewels worth the fortunes of empires, and quietly walks into an adjoining chamber. Within, Conan finds a miraculous sight. The ancient oracle of Alcmenon, asleep in a chamber of gold on a raised dais. Conan taps the dais cautiously with his sword, to no avail. The gorgeous woman dressed in armor made of gold appears motionless and likely dead. Yet by some sorcery in the Cimmerian's view, the woman appeared to still be in the prime of her life, untouched by age or time. With nowhere forward in the oracle's chamber, Conan retreats back into the great hall, and with a suspicion that there must be more to this place, he begins to investigate it.
His mind clung to a secret crypt near the oracle. Painstakingly, he began to tap along the walls, and presently his taps rang hollow at a spot opposite the mouth of the narrow corridor. Looking more closely, he saw that the crack between the marble panel at that point and the next was wider than usual. He inserted a dagger point and pried. Silently, the panel swung open, revealing a niche in the wall, but nothing else. He swore feelingly. The aperture was empty, and it did not look like it had ever served as a crypt for treasure. Leaning into the niche, he saw a system of tiny holes in the wall, about on a level with a man's mouth. He peered through and grunted understandingly. That was the wall that formed the partition between the alcove and the oracle chamber. Those holes had not been visible in the chamber. Conan grinned. This explained the mystery of the oracle, but it was a bit cruder than he had expected. Gwahlur would plant either himself or some trusted minion in that niche to talk through the holes, and the credulous acolytes would accept it as the veritable voice of Yalaya. Remembering something, the Cimmerian drew forth the roll of parchment he had taken from the mummy and unrolled it carefully, as it seemed ready to fall to pieces with age. He scowled over the dim characters with which it was covered. In his roaming about the world, the giant adventurer had picked up a wide smattering of knowledge, particularly including the speaking and reading of many alien tongues. Many a sheltered scholar would have been astonished at the Cimmerian's linguistic abilities, for he had experienced many adventures where knowledge of a strange language had meant the difference between life and death. These characters were puzzling, at once familiar and unintelligible, and presently he discovered the reason. They were the characters of archaic Pelishtim, which possessed many points of difference from the modern script with which he was familiar, and which, 3 centuries ago, had been modified by conquest by a nomad tribe. This older, purer script baffled him. He made out a recurrent phrase, however, which he recognized as a proper name, Bit Yakin. He gathered it was the name of the writer. Scowling, his lips unconsciously moving as he struggled with the task, he blundered through the manuscript, finding much of it untranslatable, and most of the rest of it obscure. He gathered that the writer, the mysterious Bit Yakin, had come from afar with his servants, and entered the valley of Alcmenon. Much that followed was meaningless, interspersed as it was with unfamiliar phrases and characters. Such as he could translate seemed to indicate the passing of a very long period of time. The name of Yalaya was repeated frequently, and toward the last part of the manuscript, it became apparent that Bit Yakin knew that death was upon him. With a slight start, Conan realized that the mummy in the cavern must be the remains of the writer of the manuscript, the mysterious Pelishtim, Bit Yakin.
Without the ability to fully grasp what the ancient scroll says, Conan shrugs and places it back in his girdle. He had gathered from the hidden alcove he had found, and the scroll, that the people of old Alcmenon, and the current population of Keshan, worshipped a false prophet in the oracle, created by a simple smoke and mirrors trick. How Bit Yakin connected to this ruse, and how the oracle Yalaya was the mouthpiece of the Keshanian elite, but also preserved perfectly by some sorcery, remained a mystery to him. In the distance, from some adjoining chamber, the Cimmerian hears a gong ring out, as if it had just been struck by a ghostly resident of this deserted place. Conan goes to investigate, and suddenly, the floor drops out from under him. He plunges into the black, icy water of an underground river and is shot away by the swift current. As he is being carried through the darkness by the river, he comes to a section of the tunnel where the light of the sun is shining through, and the barbarian spies a bronze ladder bolted to the tunnel wall. He desperately lunges for it, and grasps onto its lower rungs for dear life. He climbs up the ladder and into a chamber in the palace he had not yet stumbled across. With a grim suspicion that he was not the only creature stalking the halls of this ancient palace, Conan continues on through its halls cautiously. With all of the time he had lost after being swept into the underground river, Conan decides to hide from the Kashanian priests, and after they went through the false ritual of consulting the oracle, he planned to tail them directly to the location of the jewels. He retreats back into the chamber of the oracle to hide, and this time he notices something curious.
The body still lay as he had first seen it, silent, motionless, in breastplates of jeweled gold, gilded sandals, and silken skirt. But now there was a subtle difference. With a panicky curse, Conan ripped out his sword. "Crom! She's alive!" At his words, the long, dark lashes lifted. The eyes opened and gazed up at him inscrutably. Dark, lustrous, mystical. He glared in frozen speechlessness. He licked his dry lips and found voice. "You are you Yalaya?" he stammered. "I am Yalaya." The voice was rich and musical, and he stared with new wonder. "Do not fear. I will not harm you if you do my bidding." She lifted her arms in a mystical gesture. "I am a goddess. 1,000 years ago there descended upon me the curse of the greater gods, the gods of darkness beyond the borders of light. The mortal in me died. The goddess in me could never die. Here I have lain for so many centuries, to awaken each night at sunset and hold my court of yore, where the spectres drawn from the shadows of the past. Man, if you would not view that which will blast your soul forever, get hence quickly. I command you, go!" The voice became imperious, and her slender arm lifted and pointed. Conan, his eyes burning slits, slowly sheathed his sword, but he did not obey her order. He stepped closer, as if impelled by a powerful fascination. Without the slightest warning, he grabbed her up in a bear-like grasp. She screamed, a very ungoddess-like scream, and there was a sound of ripping silk, as with one ruthless wrench he tore off her skirt. "Goddess! Ha!" His bark was full of angry contempt. He ignored the frantic writhings of his captive. "I thought it was strange that a princess of Alcmenon would speak with a Corinthian accent. As soon as I'd gathered my wits, I knew I'd seen you somewhere. You're Muriela, Zargeba's Corinthian dancing girl. This crescent-shaped birthmark on your hip proves it. I saw it once when Zargeba was whipping you. Goddess! Bah!" All her imperiousness had gone out of her. She was no longer a mystical figure of antiquity, but a terrified and humiliated dancing girl, such as can be bought at almost any Shemetish marketplace. She lifted up her voice and wept unashamedly. "Oh, please don't hurt me! Don't! I had to do it! Zargeba brought me here to act as the oracle."
Conan initially admonishes the girl for offending the gods with her ruse, pretending to be one of them. before he inquires further about how and why she was lying in the temple, pretending to be this ancient oracle. The actress says that Zargheba, Thutmekri's right-hand man, was the other person who had been stalking the palace halls as Conan suspected. It was he who had forced Muriela to masquerade as Yelaya. Zargheba had found secret and quicker passage to the palace than Conan, removed the body of the true Yelaya from the dais, hid her body, and then replaced her with Muriela. The Shemite henchman had forced her to instruct the priests to take the teeth of Gwahlur from their hiding place, give some of them to Thutmekri as a pledge, and send the rest to Keshia. She was then to tell the priests that some awful fate would befall the kingdom of Keshan if they did not agree to Thutmekri's proposals. The final instruction she was supposed to relay to the priests was that Conan should be skinned alive. The girl bursts into tears and begs Conan to protect her from the dastardly Shemite, and Conan agrees on one condition. He tells Muriela that she must continue to play the oracle as originally planned, but this time give the priests instructions that will favor him. He tells her that she must tell the priests that it is the god's will to see Thutmekri driven from the lands of Keshan. To secure his protection, the actress must tell the priests to place the jewels of Gwahlur in the care of Conan and make him the general of the Keshanian army, for he is beloved by their gods. The girl desperately agrees and puts her oracle costume back in order successfully, despite Conan's tearing of her skirt. The barbarian tells her that he plans to go search for Zargheba and eliminate him before the priests arrive so that he doesn't interfere with their plans. The girl tells Conan where the henchman is hiding, in a thicket nearby, and the barbarian stealthily glides down the marble stairs of the palace to meet him. Conan spies the man's white face peering out of the thicket as he gets closer, and initially thinks that the Shemite had spotted him before Conan had even seen him. Curiously, however, the henchman does not react. He appears to be simply staring at the barbarian, frozen in place. Cautiously, Conan moves silently towards the Shemite until he stops at the horrifying sight before him. Zargheba's severed head is dangling from the branch of a tree, strung up by his own long black hair. There was no sign of his body anywhere, but there was a trail of blood and trampled grass that led away from the grisly scene. Conan stares wide-eyed at this gruesome sight for a moment, before he regains his senses. He had left the girl alone to find Zargheba, and he apparently wasn't the only dangerous thing roaming the grounds of the palace. He rushes towards the palace stairs, before he sees the faint glow of torches atop them, off in the distance. The Keshanian priests had arrived. The highest-ranking Keshanian priest, Gorulga, and his cadre of lower priests were flanked by another one of Thutmekri's minions, a Stygian named Gwarunga. When the priests arrive to consult the oracle, Muriela plays her part fabulously. She tells the priests that the nefarious Stygians and Shemites who had come to offer their assistance must be driven from the kingdom, as they are traitors who plot to steal from the gods. She tells them that the glorious jewels of Gwahlur and the armies of the kingdom should be placed in the care of Conan. The high priest Gorulga, possessed with genuine religious conviction, says that the oracle has spoken, and gestures for the other priests to follow him, so that they may go and retrieve the jewels of Gwahlur for Conan. As Conan watches from a distance and revels in the success of his plan, he hears Muriela scream out in terror. The Cimmerian sees Gwarunga, holding the actress by the throat in an iron grip, his face twisted into a mask of sinister fury. Gwarunga hisses at Muriela, calling her a traitor for not following Thutmekri's instructions and thereby dooming their plans to steal the jewels from Keshan. Conan attempts to cleave Gwarunga's head in half, but the widening of Muriela's eyes warn the gigantic man, and he wheels around to see Conan. Gwarunga's sudden movement caused Conan's blade to strike the man's head flat. It only causes a non-lethal but still grisly gash on his head. Conan lifts his sword to finish the job, but before he can strike, he hears Muriela scream out from within the oracle chamber. When he hastily enters, he sees the lifeless corpse of the real Yelaya laying on the dais, as he had seen when he first entered this place. Conan calls out for the girl and receives no response. However, he does notice a thin, perpendicular crack in one of the marble walls of the chamber, from which a wisp of Muriela's silk cloak now hangs. Conan thrusts his dagger into this crack and pulls with all of his might. He uncovers a doorway into a secret passage. He descends down the stairs and finds a tunnel covered with frescoes, depicting the lost and forgotten lore described in parts of the scroll he had understood about the past reign of the mysterious Bit Yakin. The barbarian then hears a scuffling beyond these paintings, within the blackness of the lightless tunnel beyond. He walks forward into the darkness, hands outstretched, and finally stumbles across a massive metal door. He tries to push it open, to no avail. Suddenly, he hears the sound of creaking metal behind the door. He recognizes it as a rusty lever being moved into place. Instantaneously, he leaps backward, and a giant block of stone that would have crushed even the massive Conan like an ant falls on the ground where he had just been standing a second ago. Something alive and intelligent had captured Muriela and disappeared behind that door. What that thing was, man or beast, the barbarian did not know. With the way forward blocked by this giant piece of stone, Conan rushes back out of the secret tunnel and back into the palace. When he returns, he finds a spattering of blood on the floor and the injured Gwarunga nowhere to be found. Without any feasible way of rescuing Muriela at this point, Conan swiftly moves out of the palace and picks up on the trail of these priests of Keshan, who had begun their journey to wherever the jewels of Gwahlur were hidden. The barbarian employs the expert tracking skills he had learned on the frozen tundras of Samaria, and eventually finds the Keshanian priests descending into yet another set of subterranean tunnels. Conan suspects that the entire valley may be connected via a system of tunnels. Perhaps Muriela lied somewhere within them, below. The Sumerian follows the priests as they perform a variety of rituals to retrieve the jewels from the cave. However, before the priests can retrieve them, an otherworldly scene begins to unfold before them.
Conan crouched in the black mouth of the tunnel, staring at the walls reflecting the lurid glow of the torches. He saw a carven stone stair winding up from tier to tier of the galleries. The roof was lost in darkness. He started violently, and the chanting broke off as the kneeling blacks flung up their heads. An inhuman voice boomed out high above them. They froze on their knees, their faces turned upward in a ghastly blue hue in the sudden glare of a weird light that burst blindingly up near the lofty roof, and then burned with a throbbing glow. That glare lighted a gallery, and a cry went up from the high priest, echoed shudderingly by his acolytes. In the flash there had been briefly disclosed to them a slim, white figure standing upright in a sheen of silk and a glint of jewel-crusted gold. Then the blaze smoldered to a throbbing, pulsing luminosity in which nothing was distinct, and that slim shape was but a shimmering blur of ivory.
"Yelaya!"
screamed Gwahlur, his brown features ashen.
Why have you followed us? What is your pleasure?"
That weird, unhuman voice rolled down from the roof, re-echoing under that arching vault that magnified and altered it beyond recognition.
"Woe to the unbelievers! Woe to the false children of Kashia! Doom to them which deny their deity!"
A cry of horror went up from the priests. Gwahlur looked like a shocked vulture in the glare of the torches.
"I do not understand,"
he stammered.
"We are faithful. In the chamber of the oracle you told us—" "Do not heed what you heard in the chamber of the oracle,"
rolled that terrible voice, multiplied until it was as though a myriad voices thundered and muttered the same warning.
"Beware of false prophets and false gods. A demon in my guise spoke to you in the palace, giving false prophecy. Now, hearken and obey, for only I am the true goddess, and I give you one chance to save yourselves from doom. Take the teeth of Gwahlur from the crypt where they were placed so long ago. Alkmenon is no longer holy, because it has been desecrated by blasphemers. Give the teeth of Gwahlur into the hands of Thutmekri the Stygian, to place in the sanctuary of Dagon and Dercato. Only this can save Kashan from the doom the demons of the night have plotted. Take the teeth of Gwahlur and go! Return instantly to Kashia. There, give the jewels to Thutmekri, and seize the foreign devil Conan, and flay him alive in the great square."
There was no hesitation in obeying. Chattering with fear, the priests scrambled up and ran for the door that opened behind the bestial god. Gwahlur led the flight. They jammed briefly in the doorway, yelping as wildly waving torches touched squirming black bodies. They plunged through, and the patter of their speeding feet dwindled down the tunnel.
Conan does not immediately follow the priests in their terrified flight out of the cavern. He seethes in rage and confusion. Yalaya's appearance this time had appeared divine, but at the same time, she had instructed the priests to play directly into the hands of his enemy. Was this Muriela once again, this time playing triple agent? Had she intended to betray him all along? Or was it the genuine oracle the barbarian had assumed was a false goddess after discovering the false wall in the palace, where a charlatan had pretended to speak for the dead prophet? Possessed with enough rage to overcome any apprehension he may have had at offending a goddess, the barbarian strides out of his hiding place and storms toward her ivory form. As he approaches and barks at her condescendingly, the form of Gwahlur lunges out at him from the shadows. Conan whirls like a cat, and in the same motion dodges the Stygian's blow. He then quickly counters, driving his blade to the hilt through Gwahlur's torso. The man writhes, gurgling on his own blood, and then stiffens as a lifeless corpse. Conan then turns to what appeared to be Yalaya, and notices that she was strapped to a pillar to make the goddess appear as if she was floating in the blue glow. This was the preserved, lifeless corpse of the oracle he had seen in the temple before Gwahlur had replaced it with Muriela. Now convinced that the encounter he had just witnessed the priests have with Yalaya was a ruse orchestrated by Gwahlur, the barbarian hurries after them into yet another tunnel. Along this path, Conan finds Muriela, chained to a massive statue of the god Pitor. Conan frees her and asks her what had transpired since she had been kidnapped by some unknown presence in Alkmenon. The girl tells Conan that she had been abducted by a group of distinctly non-human beasts. She says that her kidnappers were covered in gray hair, but walked like men and spoke in their own language, totally incomprehensible to her. The beasts had then carried her through the network of subterranean tunnels Conan had suspected lie beneath the valley of Alkmeenon, and chained her in place on this statue. The girl wonders aloud what these beasts are, and Conan mutters that he thinks he has finally put together what's going on within this seemingly haunted city.
"Servants of Bit-Yakin," he grunted. "I found a manuscript that told me a number of things, and then stumbled upon some frescoes that told me the rest. Bit-Yakin was a Pelishtim who wandered into the valley with his servants after the people of Alkmeenon had deserted it. He found the body of Princess Yelaya, and discovered that the priests returned from time to make offerings to her, for even then she was worshipped as a goddess. He made an oracle of her, and he was the voice of the oracle, speaking from a niche he cut in the wall behind the ivory dais. The priests never suspected, never saw him or his servants, for they always hid themselves when the men came. Bit-Yakin lived and died here without ever being discovered by the priests. Crom knows how long he dwelt here, but it must have been for centuries. The wise men of the Pelishtim know how to increase the span of their lives for hundreds of years. I've seen some of them myself. Why he lived here alone, and why he played the part of oracle, no ordinary human can guess. But I believe the oracle part was to keep the city inviolate and sacred, so he could remain undisturbed. He ate the food the priests brought as an offering to Yelaya, and his servants ate other things. I've always known there was a subterranean river flowing away from the lake where the people of the Puntish Highlands throw their dead. That river runs under this palace. They have ladders hung over the water where they can hang and fish for the corpses that come floating through. Bit-Yakin recorded everything on parchment and painted walls. But he died at last, and his servants mummified him according to instructions he gave them before his death, and stuck him in a cave in the cliffs. The rest is easy to guess. His servants, which were even more immortal than he, kept on dwelling here. But the next time a high priest came to consult the oracle, not having a master to restrain them, they tore him to pieces. So since then, until Goruga, nobody came to talk to the oracle. It's obvious they've been renewing the garments and ornaments of the goddess, as they'd seen Bit-Yakin do. Doubtless there's a sealed chamber somewhere where the silks are kept from decay. They clothed the goddess and brought her back to the oracle room after Zargeba had stolen her. And oh, by the way, they took off Zargeba's head and hung it up in a thicket.
After Conan explains, the two of them continue on after the Kashanian priests, hoping to steal from them the precious jewels of Gwahlur. Eventually, the pair discovers the priests gathered around a semicircle of torches. The high priest Gorulga stands in the center, with a small brass chest in his hands. Conan looks on with an intense glint of avarice in his eyes. The jewels of Gwahlur, at last. Conan's greedy gaze quickly darts away from the jewels, however, as he sees another presence enter the scene.
And slowly, with the crawling light, figures became visible, like shapes growing out of the night and silence. At first, they seemed like gray stone statues, whose motionless shapes, hairy, manlike, yet hideously human. But their eyes were alive, cold sparks of gray, icy fire. And as the weird glow lit their bestial countenances, Gorulga screamed and fell backward, throwing up his long arms in a gesture of frenzied horror. But a longer arm shot across the altar, and a misshapen hand locked on his throat. Screaming and fighting, the high priest was dragged back across the altar. A hammer-like fist smashed down, and Gorulga's cries were stilled. Limp and broken, he sagged across the altar, his brains oozing from his crushed skull. And then, The servants of Bit Yakin surged like a bursting flood from hell on the black priests who stood like horror-blasted images. Then there was slaughter, grim and appalling. Conan saw black bodies tossed like chaff in the inhuman hands of the slayers, against whose horrible strength and agility the daggers and swords of the priests were ineffective. He saw men lifted bodily, and their heads cracked open against the stony altar. He saw a flaming torch, grasped in a monstrous hand, thrust inexorably down the gullet of an agonized wretch, who writhed in vain against the arms that pinioned him. He saw a man torn in 2 pieces, as one might tear a chicken, and the bloody fragments hurled clear across the cavern. The massacre was as short and devastating as the rush of a hurricane. In a burst of red, abysmal ferocity, it was over, except for one wretch who fled screaming back the way the priests had come, pursued by a swarm of blood-dabbled shapes of horror which reached out their red-smeared hands for him. Fugitive and pursuers vanished down the black tunnel, and the screams of the human came back, dwindling and confused by the distance.
Conan and Muriela watch on in terror. While the girl is frozen, however, Conan notices amidst the carnage that the chest containing the jewels had been left unguarded. He quickly tells Muriela to remain hidden and sprints for the chest. He grabs it, calls Muriela to him, and the pair attempt to escape through the tunnels out into the cliffs surrounding the valley of the ancient city. However, Conan hears a sinister presence trailing behind them. One of the servants of Bit Yakin had followed them. Conan leaps to meet the gigantic beast, a hideous abomination somewhere between man and ape, and swings his sword with the ferocity of a wild tiger. Conan's blow severely wounds the beast, but before he can strike again, the monster swats Conan away with its mighty arm. The barbarian tumbles downward toward the rushing river below, and almost falls over a cliff. He reaches out desperately and digs his fingers into the rocks. He manages to catch himself and springs up over the edge of the cliff. As he rises to his feet, Conan sees the beast scoop Muriela into his arms. The girl drops the chest containing the jewels as she's rattled about by the monster, and Conan rushes towards the colossal figure. Before he can reach it, however, the beast begins to feel the effects of all the blood it had lost from Conan's ferocious slash. It begins to sway, dipping in and out of consciousness, and finally falls headfirst to its death. As it falls, the girl and the jewel chest both tumble towards the edge of the cliff. In this instant, Conan must choose between reaching out to save Muriela or the jewels, representing enough wealth to found a mighty empire for himself. Conan does not hesitate. He reaches out for Muriela and watches the fabled jewels of Gwahlur tumble into the ferocious tide below, likely never to be discovered again. In his arms, Muriela begins to cry, lamenting the fact that if it weren't for her, Conan would have recovered the jewels and would now be a very rich man. Conan tells her to stop and dry her tears, for there's no use in dwelling on the past. He tells her that he could use an actress like her, as the tribesmen of Punt worship a woman said to have ivory skin like hers, and wash gold out of their rivers in wicker baskets. The story ends with the barbarian gleefully telling her that they should ride to Punt, use her resemblance to the Puntian god to inform the rulers of Thutmekri's machinations against them, and offer their assistance in thwarting the Stygian rogues' plans. The Jewels of Gwahlur was a pretty interesting story for me. I have to say, I don't think I liked it quite as much as the prior 2 stories in this late period of Howard's work with Conan, The People of the Black Circle and A Witch Shall Be Born, but I did still enjoy it quite a bit due to the setting and the historical things that Howard pulls from in this one. This story takes place in the Black Kingdoms, which are the ancestors of the cultures and people of Africa in the Hyborian Age world. The kingdom we see here, Keshan, is one with a racial hierarchy that divides the black natives, who appear to embody old and traditional African native culture, and a ruling elite of white people, who claim lineage from travelers who long ago came from faraway lands, settled in what is now the kingdom of Keshan, and established at least the partial theocracy that exists there at the time of Conan's adventure that we see unfold here. This sort of society with racial castes that either partially or wholly determine an individual's role in society from birth should be familiar to citizens of the United States. But my country is not the only one that suffers from such things. Societies such as the one described in the pages of the Jewels of Gwahlur were established on the African continent as well. European colonization of Africa existed as far back as the days of the ancient Greek and Phoenician empires, but the so-called scramble for Africa period of colonization that resulted in the entire continent being carved up by the various imperial powers of Europe like the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish had its origins in the 17th century. The oldest modern colonial city established by Europeans on the African continent is Cape Town, established by the Dutch East India Company in 1652. The settlement was originally established as a refreshment outpost for Dutch East India Company ships on their way to other Dutch imperial holdings across the globe that were in need of food, water, and a place to rest. As the population of this outpost grew over time, and the Netherlands began to war with the other imperial powers of Europe, it became important to establish this territory as an official colony of the Dutch Empire. This once small outpost officially became the Cape Colony, and the Dutch settlers embarked on a quest of territorial expansion to secure more lands for this colonial holding of the empire. These lands were not unoccupied, however. Native Africans of the Khoe tribe lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers in these lands. There were many skirmishes between the Khoe and the Dutch, with victories on both sides. However, eventually the Dutch's superior military technology overwhelmed the natives. Within 50 years, the tribal societies of the Khoe that had thrived for 1,000 years near the borders of the Dutch colony had all but vanished, and their people were subjugated under Dutch rule. Most of the Khoe were incorporated into the Cape Colony, and eventually the Union of South Africa as this union of colonies grew bigger. The Khoe were designated as low-class laborers or sold into the transatlantic slave trade, unable to aspire to the wealth and privilege of the white colonists, many of which were fabulously rich retirees of the Dutch East India Company. The colony flourished for some time, until the Dutch Empire began to decline, as all empires do in time, and a war broke out between them and the British, an empire at the height of its power, looking to further expand its reach across the globe. In 1795, the British conquered the Cape Colony, making it and the rest of the South African Union an official holding of the British Crown. Little changed as a result of this conquest for the black African citizens until, ironically, the British Empire outlawed slavery across the empire writ large in 1833. After this development, some of the progress that had been made towards racial equality, particularly in the Cape Colony territory of the South African Union, were rolled back. Various measures to limit black participation in government, similar to the Jim Crow laws of the American South after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery here, were instituted. The degree to which black and white South Africans could interact with each other became a matter of government policy. People of black African descent were required to even wear badges identifying their race, echoing what Jews were required to wear years later under the Nazi regime in Germany. This explicit pursuit of segregation and white supremacy as a governing philosophy of the nation reached its greatest expression in 1948 with the election of the white nationalist National Party to power in the South African Republic. The party's platform was explicitly, they did not mince words, to ensure and continue white domination of the South African nation. Through legislation and popular support amongst the nation's minority white population, the National Party radically segregated whites and blacks in South Africa. Interracial marriage and even sexual intercourse between blacks and whites was criminalized. Roughly 80% of the nation's land was classified as white lands. These areas were restricted to whites, and only blacks who acquired special permission from the government to go into these places were allowed to enter them. The government also created what they called Bantustans, which were something resembling American Indian reservations, where black South Africans were forced to move. The nation's black population was forced to sell their land to white citizens for almost nothing, and forcibly relocated to these segregated territories. During this period of relocation, 3.5 million black South Africans were forced off their land and marginalized into extreme poverty. And keep in mind, this is the majority of people who live in the country. Like the American Indian reservations, these territories were given full governing autonomy over their lands. But this also effectively removed black South Africans from participation in national politics. These communities were also strategically located so that they would be disparate and unable to pose any organized and united threat to the white nationalist apartheid regime. Despite these attempts by the government to deter black resistance to these policies, there were significant movements of resistance against the apartheid government. Nelson Mandela, South African Communist Party member and lawyer, was amongst the most famous and prominent of the leaders of this movement to resist apartheid, and eventually negotiated the end of the nation's racist policies. Mandela and his allies negotiated with the white South African political leaders in 1990 and 1991, which culminated in the 1994 South African elections, where universal suffrage was extended to all of the nation's citizens, black and white. Mandela's Social Democratic Party, called the African National Congress, won in a landslide, and Mandela was elected as the first black South African head of state in the nation's history. The African National Congress has been in power as the most popular political party in the nation ever since. South Africa is not the only African nation that has had to struggle their way out of the grip of European colonization and white supremacy as a political ideology, but they are certainly one of the nations that had the most prolonged and difficult struggle against these forces. The Kingdom of Keshan is a society that resembles the way many of these colonial societies were structured, with a minority white ruling class descended from settlers who came from distant lands in Europe, and a majority population of native black Africans, relegated to a social class distinctly lesser than those who rule them. I can't say for certain if Howard was looking specifically at the history of South Africa, but as I said before, South Africa is not the only African nation that once had this sort of social structure, and I appreciate that Howard incorporated this dark and horrifying aspect of both African and European history into his conception of the Hyborian Age reflection of Africa. Howard's Hyborian Age setting is at its best when it's sort of an allegory for aspects of real history, and I think that this allusion to African history is one of the things that makes this story really shine. I do wish that we got a little bit more of a thorough exploration of this kingdom's society and such, but as it is, I think it has some neat historical context that reminded me of the history of Africa that Howard is setting this story in. The Jewels of Gwahlur could have went from a pretty good story to a great one if Howard got to spend a little bit more time exploring the culture of the black Africans and the white people that rule them, but as it is, I did still find the setting pretty compelling. The other historical thing that Howard borrows from here is a bit more obvious and plays a more direct role in the story, and that element is the Oracle of Alkminon. In this story, Conan realizes that the oracle of this city had always been a ruse. Someone hid in a secret chamber with holes in the wall and spoke for the oracle, who was in reality just a corpse with no otherworldly powers. Bit Yakin, likely one amongst other charlatans who took advantage of this ruse, used their false divine authority to gain political power and wealth. In ancient Greece, there was a city called Delphi, where a temple to the Greek god of prophecy and other things, Apollo, once stood. According to legend, it is said that the temple was built atop a sacred chasm, where vapors rose in steamy clouds out of the earth. These vapors were said to trigger intense visions of prophecy in those who inhaled them. These visions, triggered by the vapors, eventually attracted a cult of Apollo who resided there and created a formal religious institution to relay prophecies to the people of the Greek world, influence politics, and receive tribute for their services. The cult of Apollo that operated the Temple of Delphi consisted of a group of priests who served under the Pythia, who was the high priestess of the temple. The Pythia was the woman who served as the oracle of the temple. She supposedly received visions from Apollo himself after inhaling the vapors of the chasm. The insight of the oracle was highly sought after amongst all people in Greek society, but the favor of the gods was particularly sought after by the political leaders of the various Greek city-states, especially because of Apollo's association with politics as well as prophecy as a deity. When a prophecy was requested, the Pythia would venture into a chamber alone, where she would inhale the vapors and have these sort of insane visions and rantings. Above this chamber, there was a viewing chamber of sorts, where a group of priests would watch the Pythia relay these visions of insanity, which were often kind of incomprehensible. The priests would then interpret whatever wisdom, in their view, could be drawn from the Pythia's hysterical cries, and then would relay this wisdom to the temple's patron as to what the Pythia had prophesied about their fate. Patrons would bring riches and gifts to the temple for the Pythia and her priestly servants in exchange for a question to be answered by the Pythia and a prophecy produced. The Oracle of Delphi played a very important role in Greek politics, as her visions and the priests who relayed her messages endorsed things such as Greek colonialism, which spread Greek culture across the ancient world by the sword, and even chose favorites amongst the city-states in times where they warred against each other. According to sources like Herodotus, who worked as a priest in this temple of Apollo for a time, the Pythia was known to be susceptible to bribery, so that the word of Apollo conveniently spoke in favor of those who were able to pay the priests enough to make them fabulously rich. Just like the oracle who was exploited for the political gain of those who pulled her strings in the pages of the Jewels of Gwahlur, so too was the ancient oracle of Delphi subject to the very worldly, corrupting forces all men and women are susceptible to. It's doubtful that the Oracle of Delphi actually communicated with Apollo, and it's easy for us to look back from the vantage point of the modern world where Greek Hellenistic religion is all but dead and say that this was just a scheme to peddle power, money, and influence. But to the Greeks of that day, it was much more than that. These people genuinely believed, as the priests of Kashan believed, that the oracle was real and a powerful entity that communed with the gods. Kings, leaders of the Athenian democracy, nobles, paupers, and slaves all believed that this institution was real and had consequential divine power. Think of it as something like the Roman Catholic Church, which was a major source of political power during the medieval and Renaissance European periods. Kingdoms would rise or fall based on the standing of the king or queen's relationship with the Vatican. The people who came to see the Pythia at the Temple of Apollo in ancient Greece would likely have reacted the same way as the priests of Kashan if they saw their oracle appear in a blinding flash of blue light, seemingly afloat in the air, and speak to them in a booming voice of the divine. I think they too would have run away scared to do whatever the oracle's bidding was without question. I liked that this story took a realistic and critical look at the religious orders of humanity's ancient past, and showed them for what in many cases they really were. Reading about these sorts of things for me personally made me think about how important it is to question the religious authorities of whatever religion you're a part of. In the tradition of Martin Luther, the forerunner of the Christian Reformation, and other people who have critically examined the edicts laid down by the various clergies of the world to the faithful masses. I was raised as a Catholic by my parents, and I've often thought about these sorts of questions from an early age. How can a religious institution with a history so rife with corruption and scandal possibly be what they claim? The contradiction seems too stark. Was what once started as a genuine movement towards a better world transformed as it grew to become an inseparable arm of the Roman imperial system, and later the monarchies of Europe, into something even Jesus Christ would renounce? Is it just like the Pythia and the Oracle of the Jewels of Gwahlur, a cheap parlor trick that is cynically aimed at peddling power, wealth, and influence? Or is there something more? Does the Church offer something genuinely useful in the lives of the faithful? I have grappled with these questions my entire life, and I don't think I have a definitive answer. I'm not sure if I ever will. You may think you do on one side or the other, and more power to you, but regardless, this story offers quite interesting food for thought in my view about human civilization and the social structures and individuals within, like all of Howard's best Conan stories. I also quite like that this story once again demonstrates Conan's barbaric intellect, born of his experience living as a wild man and adventurer. I think the impression some people have of Conan based on some of his appearances in other media is that he's sort of a lunkhead. I've heard people say he's sort of a dim but strong man prone to bloodshed and greed. While Conan can be greedy, he's definitely strong and definitely revels in battle, he's not a dumb man. Dumb men do not usually rise to become kings, after all, and stay on the throne for very long in an age as barbarous as the Hyborian one. Conan shows in this story that he has adept skills as a linguist. In his travels across the world, he's come to know many languages and dialects as a matter of necessity. While he wasn't educated on these things in one of the academies of civilized men, he still has skills that rival them, born out of his experiences as a wandering rogue. Sometimes, understanding what someone is saying when they don't expect you to understand them can be the difference between life and death in strange and distant lands that you've never traveled to before. Conan also shows that he is an adept tracker. He has no trouble tailing the priests and the various henchmen he goes after in this story, due to his time as a hunter-gatherer living on the frozen tundras of Samaria. Without these skills, Conan would have starved and died in such harsh conditions, and the experience he has with them serve him well in this story. This is one of the aspects of Conan's character that I find the most interesting, his wit and cunning that comes with the life he's chosen to lead, for better or worse. This plays on the eternal theme of most Conan stories, barbarism versus civilization. Are Conan's ways of the wild man inferior to that of civilized men? Are they superior? Is there even much of a difference between them other than pomp and circumstance? This is the aspect of the character that has made him so interesting and iconic, and those qualities are on full display in this story. Where this story stumbles a bit for me compared to the prior two in this late period of Howard's Conan work is how the story's actually structured. I felt as if the story could have been revised a bit to include a few less characters and changed it around a bit to make it more engaging. This story introduces a character named Thutmekri, who Conan has a pre-existing relationship with. Their relationship sounds really interesting based on the backstory we're told about, regarding who this man is and what his counteroffer to the priests of Kashan is that ends up being more lucrative than Conan's. However, the story never includes any scenes with this character. We only deal with his henchmen and things that are said about them. And his henchmen, I have to be honest, aren't particularly interesting. They're just kind of standard fare bad guys. I think it would have been more interesting if Thutmekri was the primary human antagonist of the story, along with the monstrous servants of Bit Yakin as the villains of the story. Conan was willing to do his dirty work in order to succeed in his machinations to find the jewels, so why not Thutmekri as well? I was also a bit perplexed that we have a scene in the secret tunnels covered in frescoes that make Conan put the whole background of Bit Yakin, the Oracle, and the priests of Kashan together in his mind, but we don't learn what exactly he pieced together until almost the very end of the story. I sort of wish that we learned this information as Conan did. It's sort of awkward that Conan pieces all this together and we aren't privy to what he's thinking about until later. However, despite these pitfalls, I did still quite enjoy The Jewels of Gwahlur. It's a good story, not quite a great one, I'd say, that has some interesting historical parallels and ideas to ponder. I'd say it's a pretty good read. And so, we've come to the end of my review and retrospective on The Jewels of Gwahlur. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, but before I let you go, I'd like to say a few words regarding how you can experience this story yourself and support the show if you'd like. In the description of this video below, I've included a link to a free audiobook of the Jewels of Gwahlur for your listening pleasure. It's the same audiobook that I took excerpts from for this video, so if you liked the narration that's provided here, definitely check that one out, and, you know, it's pretty hard to pass up free things, so I would definitely check it out if you would like to listen to the story rather than read the prose. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean quite a bit to me if you subscribed to the channel, liked the video, and posted your thoughts on this story, my video, or anything else Conan related in the comments below. All of these sorts of engagements with the video here on YouTube help Conan Chronicles get recommended to more people as they surf YouTube looking for things to watch. There's a ton of stuff that gets uploaded on YouTube every day, so it can be difficult to cut through the noise of what everyone else is doing, but YouTube does promote videos that get lots of views, likes, and comment engagements, so it definitely helps, and that's the easiest thing you can do to help support the show. I've also set up a Patreon for Conan Chronicles where you can support the show monetarily. Any amount you can chip in really helps, and you'll get access to the Grog House podcast, which is my unscripted Conan Patreon podcast that I do with my co-host Josh. 2 movie commentaries on the first Conan movie and Conan the Destroyer that are a part of that podcast that's exclusive to Patreon are going up this month, the month of May. So if you'd like to get access to those, definitely check out the Patreon and pledge whatever you can. Chipping in however you can always really helps as well. Conan Chronicles is also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so if you never want to miss an episode, get updates on the show, and see some awesome pieces of Conan artwork, please check out these pages. And with all of that said, I'd like to invite you, dear listener, to join me for the next episode. In the next show, we're going to be taking a look at the 15th Conan story in publication order, Beyond the Black River. Until we meet next, dear listener, I bid you farewell.
He ran out on the span, straight toward the oncoming monster. It was no ape. Neither was it a man. It was some shambling horror spawned in the mysterious, nameless jungles of the south, where strange life teemed in the reeking rot without the dominance of man, and drums thundered in temples that had never known the tread of a human foot. Man and monster, they met at the highest arch of the span, where, 100 feet below, rushed the furious black water. As the monstrous shape with its leprous gray body and the features of a carven, inhuman idol loomed over him, Conan struck as a wounded tiger strikes, with every ounce of thew and fury behind the blow. That stroke would have sheared a human body asunder, but the bones of the servant of Bit Yakin were like tempered steel. Yet even tempered steel could not wholly have withstood that furious stroke. Ribs and shoulder bone parted, and blood spouted from the great gash. There was no time for a second stroke. Before the Cimmerian could lift his blade again or spring clear, the sweep of a giant arm knocked him from the span as a fly is flicked from a wall. As he sprang up, he saw the monster, spurting blood hideously, rush toward the cliffside of the bridge, obviously intending to descend the stair that connected the arches and renew the battle. But the monster was slowing, like clockwork running down. Blood gushed in torrents from that terrible gash in his breast, and he lurched drunkenly from side to side. Suddenly he stumbled, reeled, and toppled sidewise, pitched headlong from the arch and hurtled downward.